So, hello everybody, and welcome to the final event of ADH's Weekend of Mark Fisher. It's been a great 2 days, and I'm very happy for all the people who came to give their lectures, give their talks. And we're going to finish this one with a discussion. First of all, about the ADH. We are a group mostly based in Germany, strongly influenced by left accelerationists and Mark Fisher. But we do have members outside of Germany, so if you are interested in us, we're always very happy for people who text us from outside of Germany. And 2 years ago, we read an article by Efraim Carlebach in the Platypus review dealing with Mark Fisher and his meaning, his role for the left today, and his theoretical background. And it was quite critical of Fisher, and we desperately wanted to, or maybe not desperately, but we did really want to engage in a discussion. And I'm very glad that this discussion can happen now on our Mark Fisher weekend. I'm going to post the link to ADH's website in the chat shortly. So if you're interested, I'd be happy if you check it out. Our speakers today are Efraim Carlebach, who's part of Platypus London, and as I mentioned, is writing for the Platypus Review regularly, and our member Dennis, who is currently studying for his PhD in Manchester in philosophy, and is a very active ADH member. So in about 50 minutes, I'll be taking your questions in the chat, so as to not to stretch it out too much when I collect the questions. And then we're going to start in about an hour with answering questions. With that, I'd like to give the word to Ephraim, and now he and Dennis are going to have some minutes to give their opening statements before we can engage in a discussion.
Great. Can you all hear me okay?
I can hear you. Great.
Thank you very much for having me. If people would like to find out more about Platypus, you can visit our website, platypus1917.org. We have chapters around the world. I'd just quickly like to advertise our German language conference, which takes place next weekend on Zoom with a range of events. And if you're interested, you can visit the Facebook page of Platypus Leipzig, and I just posted in the chat the event page. So I'm going to expand on some of the themes of my article in relation to left accelerationism. Like Dennis, I want to treat Mark Fisher's claims to politics more than his cultural commentary, although we can discuss that later. Those who claim to be politically inspired by Fisher, like the ADH, tend to do so under the rubric of left accelerationism. In my article, that's where I located both Fisher's critical purchase and the problem of what I called forgetting. So I want to interrogate left accelerationism in the long aftermath of the New Left to illuminate Fisher's relationship to the left today and the regression in the 20th century. According to Mark Fisher, Marxism is nothing if it is not accelerationist. So what is the relationship between Marxism and accelerationism? Fisher and other accelerationists usually discuss matters in terms of the future and the past. Capitalist realism for Fisher meant a world in which the future has been cancelled. To the extent that it proposes any politics, accelerationism seeks to embrace technological change and rediscover the future. Fisher said that Marxism must be a kind of futurism. However, this orientation to the concept of the future is not conducive to thinking through Marxism's concern with history, consciousness, and critique. In his article, What is Promethean Politics?, Dennis Kramer argues that we must read Marx as a science fiction economist, adding, Marx predicted the future and he was right. I prefer Lenin's characterization in State and Revolution. Marx did not set out to discover the political forms of the future. He limited himself to exact observation of French history. Marx's teaching is a summing up of experience. The demand to accelerate is a one-sided expression of the self-contradiction of time within capitalism, the increasing superfluity and necessity of labor time as the measure of value. Capitalism feels simultaneously too fast and too slow. The world is too much with us, late and soon. The proto-form of the class struggle was the Luddites, who smashed their employers' machines. The owners of the machines thought this barbaric behavior accelerated the disintegration of society, destroying the social wealth in which all had a share, the progress of which was advanced by the investment of their stock in useful production. The workers thought that the disintegration of society was accelerated by the machines. Their protest unwittingly accelerated the development of large factory production, which could not be so easily vandalized and employed women and children. When the worker exchanges his labor for a wage, is he accelerating what Deleuze called the movement of the market, or re-establishing the bourgeois social relations that lag behind and constrain the industrial forces of production? Working class trade unions demanded higher pay for shorter time, thus incentivizing the capitalists' investment in labor-saving technology, which would increase the temporal intensity of their work and exacerbate the self-contradiction of labor. Graemer is right to bring up Luxemburg's point in Reform or Revolution, that where unions oppose technical innovation, they do not act in the interest of the entire working class and its emancipation, which accords rather with technical progress. He concludes that while Luxemburg normally advocates any industrial action to improve the situation of the working class, she makes an exception where strikes against the technical development of the productive forces are concerned. However, this misses the main point of her argument, a deeper critique of the self-contradictory character of trade unionism per se, as inadequate to the task of overcoming capitalism. Without the political party and its goal of socialism, no particular industrial action can be in the interest of the entire working class and its emancipation. When Bernstein infamously stated, "The movement is everything, the goal is nothing," Luxemburg responded, "It is the final goal alone which constitutes the spirit and the content of our socialist struggle, and which turns it into a class struggle." Luxemburg points out that the revisionists talk so much about the future, but end up regressing to the past. This is instructive. She thought they lacked consciousness of history. In an earlier speech, she specified, "By final goal, we must not mean this or that image of the future, but the prerequisite of any future society, namely the conquest of political power. That is, the political act required to raise the crisis of society to the level at which it can be consciously worked through rather than dominate us." Lenin's infamous statement that socialist consciousness could only be brought to workers from without did not refer to a set of predictions about the future, but to the Marxist understanding of the working class, the trade unions, and the party as self-contradictory phenomena of capitalism, which required critique from the standpoint of history. The economism of Rabachaya Diallo argued, quote, "The task of the revolutionary is only to accelerate objective development." They opposed Marxism for emphasizing the subjective, which they thought, quote, "belittled the significance of the objective or the spontaneous element." For Lenin, however, quote, "the spontaneous development of the working class movement leads to its subordination to bourgeois ideology, i.e. tailing after progressive liberal trade unionism and reforms, as in the British Labour Party." Lenin observed how the determinism of economism was the flip side of the voluntarism of anarchist terrorism. Lenin called the latter liberals with bombs. Mark Fisher once affirmed Alex Williams' claim that as an anti-capitalist strategy, accelerationism is terroristic. Perhaps left accelerationists, then, are liberals with 3D printers. Does accelerationism merely remind us not to be technophobic? That would specify very little about one's politics. For instance, in Inventing the Future, left accelerationists Williams and Cernacek cite the Cold War Soviet space program, as well as Labour Party Prime Minister Harold Wilson's 1963 speech on the white heat of technology as models for their politics. But when Harold Wilson said in 1963 that in the age of rapid automation, there is no room for Luddites in the Socialist Party, and that in the white heat of this revolution, there will be no place for restrictive practices, everyone knew he was attacking the unions and the Labour left. They didn't yet know that he was about to backtrack on his promise to the left to pursue unilateral disarmament of the 60s most advanced piece of technology, the nuclear bomb. Technophilia and technophobia, cyberpunks and Luddites. This antinomy is not a mistake, but a real expression of capitalism, just like voluntarism and determinism, or individualism and collectivism. A sure sign of the death of the left is its collapse into one side or the other of these antinomies. Fisher once said, capitalist realism is a pathology of the left. Accelerationism takes inspiration from the new left's critique of the old left, specifically French postmodernism's critique of the French Communist Party. For instance, in Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari criticized former French Communist Party member and Maoist Samir Amin, saying that his advice to third world countries to withdraw from the world market was a curious revival of the fascist economic solution. They proposed instead that the revolutionary path might be, quote, in the movement of the market, not to withdraw from the process, but to accelerate the process. In Libidinal Economy, Lyotard attacked moralistic political intellectuals who explained to the proletariat their alienation. He proposed that the proletariat rather abhor these therapeutics and Vaseline. They rather enjoy bursting under capitalism's quantitative excesses. In this vein, Fisher made several important criticisms of the contemporary left. He said the left's actual aim was not to replace capitalism, but mitigate its worst excesses, that it endlessly repeats older gestures of rebellion and contestation as if for the first time, masking its true morose conservatism. However, the postmodernists' object of critique, Stalinism, was no longer around, and the 90s anti-globalization movement, against which the accelerationists directed their cybernetic ire, was nowhere near as politically coherent or significant. Accelerationism lacks political specificity. Hence, as the financial crisis hit, Nick Land drifted further right, and Fisher became closer to the anti-neoliberal left. No longer so sure about accelerating the movement of the market, Fisher distinguished his left brand of accelerationism by adding the communist, Alain Badiou, to his regular palette of Deleuze and Lyotard. Accelerationism's critique of the left was based on its understanding of capitalism and history. In capitalist realism, Fisher's left modification of Deleuze and Guattari's account of capitalism, with the addition of Badiou, was seamless. This is because they shared a common root in Althusser. Althusser sought to salvage a supposedly materialist and ontological Marx by converting the Hegelian emphasis on history into the mere contingency of the event, and following Lacan, denouncing the subject as no more than an illusion. These ideas should be familiar to everyone who has read capitalist realism, where Fisher famously argues, citing Badiou, that the task of radical thinkers is to show that everything is mere contingency. Marx, on the other hand, emphasized the emergence of freedom with society based on bourgeois social relations of labor as a task, in which history became the site of our self-production and self-transformation. But a new problem emerged in the 19th century, the self-contradiction of bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production. As Horkheimer put it, machines made not work, but the workers superfluous. Capital was a form of estranged labor, pointing to the need to overcome precisely those social relations that gave rise to it. Nick Land knew very well that this Marxist account of capital, with its emphasis on social relations and history, would have to be changed if it was to be consummate with accelerationism. In a blog post on precursors to accelerationism, Land cites extensively the famous passage from the Communist Manifesto, in which all that is solid melts to air. Unfortunately for Land, this is where Marx and Engels explain, quote, the bourgeoisie historically has played a most revolutionary part. Land astutely comments, If Marx and Engels had systematically substituted capitalism for the bourgeoisie in this passage, its accelerationist credentials would have been vastly upgraded. In capitalist realism, Mark Fisher did exactly that. He quotes from the same passage in the Communist Manifesto, but removes the words the bourgeoisie and places in square brackets the word capital. Land, as a right accelerationist, could be more honest about... Thank you. Land, as a right accelerationist, could be more honest about the stakes of this change and his difference with Marx than Fisher could as a left accelerationist. It's in this anti-Hegelian and anti-Marxist mode that accelerationism fetishizes and hypostasizes technology. For the accelerationists, capital will not be ultimately unmasked as exploited labor power. Humans are the meat puppet of capital, their self-understandings simulations. Where Marx understood capital to be not a thing, but a social relation, and technology to be not independent, but socially mediated, the accelerationists pose technology and social relations in an external relationship in which industrial production is seen as intrinsically independent of the capitalist economy and potentially outlasting it. As Moshe Postone once observed, this leads to a notion of socialism as the linear continuation of the industrial mode of production to which capitalism gave rise. Thus, accelerationism comes full circle, from new left critique of Stalinist and social democratic parties back to linear progressive state reforms. In the crisis of neoliberalism, indeed, Mark Fisher dropped his Leotardian rejection of Vaseline for the working class and got all excited by the mention of the welfare state by Welsh nationalists, let alone Corbyn. He blamed Brexit on nostalgia for empire, invoking Paul Gilroy's post-colonial critique of the British working class, which owes more to Samir Amin's third worldism than to Deleuze and Guattari. This shift is a form of political and historical forgetting, or regression. As Theodor Adorno wrote over 70 years ago, those schooled in dialectical theory are reluctant to indulge in positive images of the proper society, of its members, even of those who would accomplish it. Past traces deter them. In retrospect, all social utopias since Plato's merge in a dismal resemblance to what they were devised against. The leap into the future, clean over the conditions of the present, lands in the past. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ephraim. So next is Dennis. You can start now.
Sorry, did you say something? I had this short disconnect.
No, sorry. Ephraim has finished and you are now able to speak.
Okay, so thank you very much to be here, Ephraim. I was really looking forward to this. And yeah, we'll just begin now. So basically in my first talk here, I will introduce why I think Mark Fisher is important to the left today. And I think I will begin with a quote from Pete Wolfendale, whom we had the honor to host here yesterday. And he called Mark Fisher one of the greatest strategists of class war. And this is a thesis that I would wholeheartedly agree with. I think he's a strategist of class war. And furthermore, I hope to lend some plausibility to the idea that he was a materialist strategist. And this is basically what, in my mind, sets him apart from Platypus's chief theoretician, Chris Catrone, who I think tends to go a little bit too much in the idealist direction. But just let me explain. So, Ephraim, can you hear me? Oh, perfect, because I just need someone to move a little bit so that I know when I lose connection that I can immediately restart it or something. Okay, so basically, I think there are a lot of similarities between ADH and Platypus. For example, we both reject the new left. We both reject the postmodernism, woke culture, identity politics, postcolonial theory, and all of this contemporary bullshit that's all around the left. So this is something where we are really similar. Also, we are similar in comparing our contemporary left with the left of the early 20th century, with orthodox Marxism, with Luxemburg, Lenin, Trotsky, with the revolutionary politics, mass movements, socialist parties. And then we look at this and we are like, okay, fuck, something happened. The way we are right now, it's not how it used to be. We want to, in some way, go back, orient ourselves towards this revolutionary Marxism, which we see in history, and which we don't see in our present today, at least not in the developed countries. So this is our common project where I think ADH and Platypus are basically on the same page. And we also appeal roughly to a similar group of people, like leftists who are pissed off with the contemporary left. Although I think that ADH, we just don't just want like the theory people and academics, we also want a lot of people who have practical skills with IT, graphics design, and so on. But basically, I think in general, we attract also a similar crowd of people who don't like the contemporary left and want to change something. Okay, so this is our similarities, but what are our differences? And I think the differences arise when we ask the question, why is the left so shitty right now? So basically, what happened? Why are we not content with what we see on the left today? And I think that for Platypus, for you guys, it's basically that Lukács and also like Cliff Slaughter, that they gave the correct answer to this. And we think our guy is Mark Fisher. And now I want to explain why. Okay, so for Mark Fisher, what's most interesting to me is his theory of capitalist realism, what he's also most famous for. And I think that this theory explains what you would call the regression of the left. So that it's like a good explanation for what happened to the left, and that it also gives us some ideas about how we can change it. So what is capitalist realism? It's the idea that there is no alternative to the current status quo. So it's like a pervasive mood, Mark Fisher calls it, that is permeating society, and that we think, okay, there's just no alternative to capitalism, there's no alternative to neoliberalism even, and we cannot really change anything about the world we live in. So it's impossible, okay? It's some kind of hopelessness, or like, yeah, it's just inability to act and to change something. You just accept what is given as being unchangeable. And you know, then there's this famous Margaret Thatcher quote, "There is no alternative," or often you hear people quote Francis Fukuyama, who talks about the end of history. So basically all of this stuff, this is meant by capitalist realism. But capitalist realism is not just like a theory, which some people believe in and others don't. It's a mood. So Mark Fisher believes that it's like a collective phenomenon, at least in the countries in the Western world, like Britain, Germany, America. It's a collective phenomenon. It's not just something some conservatives or liberals or neoliberals believe. It's like what everyone believes, okay? And this capitalist realism gives us a good explanation what happens basically in society. So Mark Fisher has talked a lot about art or pop culture in general. For example, he notes that there is like a general stagnation, that we don't have new forms of art, not really like the same thing like we had the 60s, 70s, the 80s. And then if you took one piece of music from one of those ages and put it like 10 years into the past, people would be like, what the fuck is this? But now we don't have this kind of rapid change anymore. And this for Mark Fisher symbolizes some kind of like a stoppage, like something isn't working anymore. We have no future. And yeah, nothing really dies, nothing develops. We have the universalization of retro, and the superhero movies part 10 or something like this. We have like Malchat Dama, this Russian Duma music, which is basically 80s post-punk with a little bit of gimmicks and stuff. And so nothing changes really anymore in culture. And this is like one aspect of capitalist realism where we can see it in pop culture in our everyday lives. But we can also see capitalist realism somewhere else, and it's in politics. Capitalist realism is not just something that, as I said, that like the neoliberals believe in, even the left believes in it. Like I even remember, like I believed in it. Like I was like once I was an anarchist and then a communist, and I really was like, yeah, we have to do class struggle. But if I was really honest to myself, I've never believed that I will see a communist revolution or something. Like it was just something you dreamt about and you wanted, but you didn't believe that it might happen. And now think about it. Let's just assume that everyone in society believes that there is no alternative. What effect would this have on the left? So I give you 4 examples. First example is the social democracy. So this is like the reaction of progressives and leftists who are confronted with capitalist realism, and they basically accept it. They say, okay, you're right, people. There's no alternative. So we cannot really change anything. We cannot abolish capitalism. It's not even possible to do like a real welfare state again. So we have to go with the flow. We have to accept neoliberalism. But if we are the ones who do it, we can make it a little bit more humane. So I think this is a really, it's a totally understandable reaction if you believe that there is no alternative. Okay, then you just become a Blairite, or like Tony Blair is a good example, Gerhard Schröder from the German SPD, or really from the SPD, or for example, you have Bill Clinton after the Conservatives were in power. So it's basically always this kind of thing that even the Social Democrats, they become neoliberals because they surrender. Margaret Thatcher even said that this is her biggest victory. Like there was a dinner party and they asked her, hey, what's your biggest victory? And she said, it's New Labour, Tony Blair. We forced our enemies to change their minds. Then we have the privatization of politics, like people who retreat from politics and they just consume like vegan stuff or green stuff and free fair trade, and they live a good life and they try not to be racist, do critical whiteness. So they privatize politics. What should be political problems, they become private problems. We have symbolic politics, like for example, you found a Marx reading circle and you are the one who has really understood Marx, like you know everything about the value form and stuff like this, or you have just understood everything. So you can symbolically distance yourself from capitalism. Like it's still out there, it's still there, but you know how it works. You are a critic of it. So you have like created some distance between yourself and the system. And I mean, the less sophisticated form of this would be just to throw stones at the police or something. You will also create this distance, which allows you to live your life in capitalism, under capitalism, and just, okay, because I'm distanced from it. So these are free forms like social democracy, surrender, or privatization. Just eat the best food, like the fair trade food. Or third, you make the symbolic gestures. Fourth thing is defensive politics. So basically localized politics, small scale politics, very unambitious politics, which is like defending this autonomous center in Germany, or just doing some very much defensive work against neoliberal policies. And this is what Mark Fisher calls the immobilizer. So they just want to, like, they cannot attack, they just want to stop the push of neoliberalism. Like they want to prolong the inevitable. And now all of these forms of left-wing politics, which we have come to hate, and also like identity politics and all of the stuff, it's basically totally explained if you think, oh, these people who do this, they just don't believe that we can change anything. If we can't change anything, then it's rational in some way even, or at least understandable that people like devolve and do these kinds of politics, that they just want to be Tony Blair and make something a little bit less evil, which has to be done anyways, or that they just retreat into private life or something like this, or do critical whiteness awareness courses. So all of these phenomena on the left, they show us that something's wrong because people don't believe that they can change anything. So what causes this capitalist realism? This is the interesting question. Why is there capitalist realism? And like one of the answers Fisher provides us with is just to say it's propaganda by the ruling classes. So they say, yeah, people, you can't change anything. And then people believe this. Okay, this is a rather crude thing. I'm sure it happens, but it's not the main point. The main point is that capitalist realism is caused by defeats. So defeats of the working class. On defeats of the left, if you have these historic defeats again and again, people are demoralized and so they cannot fight anymore. I quote him, for any British left-wing person remembering the mid-1980s is liable to provoke a sadness that is visceral, choking, wrenching. I still can't recall without weeping the day when the miners returned to work in 1985 and after a year of strike. What I've called capitalist realism, the deeply embedded belief that there is no alternative to capitalism, was definitely established in the UK during that period, in Margaret Thatcher's second term in government. Her re-election proved to be a traumatic defeat for the British left in general and for the Labour Party in particular. Labour began its long march towards Blairism and its eventual complete capitulation to neoliberalism and corporate tyranny. Meanwhile, the crushing of the miners' strike and the wave of privatizations that the Tories unleashed created the conditions for the neoliberal Britain that is only now falling apart 30 years later. So it's caused by material defeats. This is the important thing. And capitalist realism is a collective depression. And here it's important, like yesterday, the Christian Bertschulte told us that Mark Fisher always believed that his own depression expressed societal defects, that his own like psychological state is mirroring the failures of the economic system of capitalism. And the same is the case for the collective depression of capitalist realism. Capitalist realism has causes in the basis of society, like it's this phenomenon of the superstructure, but it has its causes in the basis, in what happens in the economy, technology, for example, which changes how we work, but mainly, as we have seen in this quote, defeats of the working class. So Mark Fisher's theory of capitalist realism must be read as a materialist conception of class struggle. It's the idea that class consciousness mirrors the balance of power between the classes. It was the defeat of the miners' strike that created this pervasive, all-encompassing social depression of the whole like proletariat, which then makes it unable to act in the future. Okay, so what can we do to change it? Like, if this is the reason, then what we have to do to change it obviously we have to fight capitalist realism. On the one hand, we can do it on a discursive level by creating concrete utopias, which of course you won't like because it's against this Adorno's prohibition of images of the future, Bilderverbot. But we think it's very important that we show people how socialism could work and how it could be organized economically.
About 1 minute left.
Okay. Then we also can provide viable strategies, and we can do all of these things in art and theory. But what's most important is that the theory of capitalist realism tells us that we must intervene on the material basis of society. So Mark Fisher says that, I quote, "What is needed is a new struggle over work and who controls it." Mark Fisher sees the connection between the reality on the ground and the consciousness of the proletariat. It's not just ideas, but real successes, which can lead people out of the trauma-induced collective depression. It's about the recovery of trust in ourselves, in modernism, and in collective action, and in like different kinds of struggle, like trade unionist struggle and stuff like this. So I just want to say, okay, now we have this kind of economism debate and stuff. I'm really looking forward to it. And I also really looking forward to elaborating a little bit more what left accelerationism is. I just want to finish with one quote of Mark Fisher. Okay, the tiniest event can tear a hole in the gray curtain of reaction, which has marked the horizons of possibility under capitalist realism. From a situation in which nothing can happen, suddenly everything is possible again. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. So Ephraim will now have the first opportunity to answer to Dennis's points.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, there's so much to respond to. First of all, let me make just one kind of provocation at the start. The quote you began with, that Mark Fisher was a leading strategist of class war, is clearly hyperinflated language. There is no class war at the moment, and so it has no strategists. And I think you should kind of feed back into the kind of Mark Fisher's own narrative of the defeat of class struggle, even in the 70s and 80s, into that kind of perspective. And it seems to me that such inflated language is precisely an expression of the kind of depression that results from inability to do something. So, you know, where I think Adorno would have the category of pseudo activity, that really represents a kind of block, one's own powerlessness. I think that kind of inflated language is similarly a reflection of that. On Platypus and the ADH, I think you're right about some of the similarities, but I'd just like to pick up on one point, which is that we reject the new left. I think this is an interesting point because Mark Fisher in Capitalist Realism has a rejection, he has a critique of the new left that he kind of takes from Zizek. And then towards the end of his life, he kind of had a rapprochement with the new left over the idea of acid communism and consciousness raising. Platypus doesn't reject the new left. We're actually asking a kind of more meta question about the symptomology that emerged from the new left, right? It's not simply a question of us rejecting or accepting this or that, but asking, why did these things emerge and how are they acting on us today? How might we be repeating them unconsciously? And I think what I tried to present in my opening is that the trajectory from Deleuze and Guattari to Nick Land to Mark Fisher to left accelerationism is one of kind of unconsciously repeating questions posed by the new left in an increasingly less self-conscious way, to the point where it returns to actually, you know, defending the welfare state, kind of pre-new left politics. So on capitalist realism, you know, obviously one thing to point out about capitalist realism is that it's a pun on socialist realism. And he has the partner term of market Stalinism, which is I kind of like that, you know. But it doesn't necessarily tie it to the issue of culture, right, quite strongly. And I think accelerationism altogether, thinking about Fisher's trajectory, is really a phenomenon about culture. And this is why I kind of perhaps subtly try to suggest that it's actually a form of romanticism. The kind of cybernetics, the invocation of Gothic aesthetic, that's all a kind of late romanticism. One of the problems with capitalist realism, I think, came up in your talk, is that it's too tied to neoliberalism, right? So the death of the left didn't happen when the miners lost the strike or went back to work in 1985, right? This is a problem going all the way back to the 1920s. And so capitalist realism, unlike the regression thesis,
1 minute,
is unable to think about the defeat of the revolution going all the way back to the 1920s. I think, you know, and the idea that, you know, culture was still progressive in the 60s, 70s, and 80s really romanticizes the conditions of capitalism in the mid-20th century. And I think that's what enables the collapse back into a kind of neo-social democracy for Fisher, who had a critique of social democracy, and he thought social democracy was capitalist realist, and then basically said that's the only option we have, and that will lead us to post-capitalism, which is an intentionally vague term. The question of defeats, right? Obviously, the left is defeated because it's defeated, right? That becomes kind of circular. The issue is, what is the meaning of defeats, and can we learn from them? So Rosa Luxemburg famously talked about the path of the proletariat is marked by defeats. But the role of the party and of Marxism was to institutionalize the experience of the working class, to be able to reflect critically on its own history and therefore to learn from the defeats. So there isn't a progress of the working class within capitalism. Last point before I hand back over would be, I think you don't do Fisher justice enough, but I think you underemphasize the extent to which in capitalist realism he tried to develop a theory of capitalism. So for example, the idea that one expression of capitalist realism is that we can allow it to persist because we think we have the critique and so it exists out there. That's what he borrows from Zizek, this kind of big other, and that capitalism doesn't care about your disavowal of it, right? That is very much tied to the theory he has of the history of capitalism that he gets from Badiou and also from Deleuze and Guattari. And I think you kind of underemphasize the extent to which he ties capitalist realism to what he thinks capitalism is. And maybe that's something we can discuss further, how it affects this debate, how one actually defines capitalism.
All right, thank you. Now Dennis has an opportunity.
Okay, so there's a lot of things we can talk about. First, just shortly, something about left accelerationism. I think it's, in some sense, it's even wrong to say that Mark Fisher is a left accelerationist. Like, he's definitely an accelerationist in some sense, because he's like a pupil of Nick Land. And I think this is really important. Like, he is a Landian. And this is the one thing I really didn't like about Christian Wertschulte's talk about Fisher, because he didn't even mention Land, I think. And for me, like, Land is totally important for Fisher. Like, Fisher is a 100% a Landian. But this is the thing, left accelerationists, as we understand them, like Srinek and Williams and Pete Wolfendale, they are not Landians. Like, they come from this tradition, but they radically break with the philosophical ideas behind Landianism. So, for example, we have this transcendental materialism, which is not like the historical materialism I want to defend. And I say that, like, Fisher is both. He's a transcendental materialist and historical materialist. But Land is definitely this transcendental materialist. So he doesn't believe that, like, if I say something, like, let's say I say, this is a smartphone, that this has any truth value. He thinks it's just an emanation of the primary process. And therefore, you know, so this is kind of his view. And Mark Fisher adopts this view, and it has an important role in his politics also. So, and this is precisely what the neo-rationalist left accelerationists deny. So they don't want to accelerate anything like the capitalist process or something. Marx wanted to do this. Like, Marx said we have to accelerate capitalism, like, for example, in the free trade speech and stuff like this. So it's a Marxist position to accelerate this capitalist process, but it's not a left accelerationist position, interestingly. Like, the left accelerationists don't believe in this thing. They want to accelerate, like, the side of the subject, like us. We have to accelerate our thinking and our organizing and stuff like this. So basically, in this sense, you can clearly say that Mark Fisher, he is a leftist and an accelerationist, but he's not this left accelerationist in the same sense the neo-rationalists are. So for classic, like, what we mean with left accelerationism, like Srinek and Williams and stuff like this, it's basically first criticism of folk politics. Like, they say, okay, people, please stop just doing these small scale, like, gardening projects, or just meeting in a small groups and doing some kind of low-key local work, or doing just a few, like, ritualized demonstrations. So this kind of thing, politics of immediacy, they call it folk politics, and this is what they criticize. And they criticize it in favor of strategy. So left accelerationism at first means fuck folk politics, let's do strategy. And the second thing is, it's an affirmation of technology and complexity. So it's basically just a reaffirmation of the Marxist idea that we want to take over the means of production and not destroy modern civilization and society. So that we are not Luddites, but we want to take over, repurpose, and refunction the whole, like, technological apparatus that capitalism has created. So in this sense, left accelerationism is really, really, it's not something totally fancily new or something. It's just basically returning to Marxism in some very important aspects that have been forgotten by a large part of the contemporary left. So I think in our discussion that we are having right now, we don't have to discuss left accelerationism in this sense, because I think with these theses, we are both in a general sense on board, okay?
If you want 1 minute.
Okay, so this is the thing about left accelerationism. What I think what we should discuss, and what is very much touching upon Mark Fisher and the whole idea is, has he become a social democrat, is the question of historical materialism and the role of consciousness and revolutionary leadership with regard to the proletariat, and also of the what Luxemburg calls spontaneity and this whole stuff. I think it's totally crucial to your Platypus project. Like everything in your theory is geared towards this. Like you read Lukács, you permanently, like if I watch your talks or the talks by Chris Catrone, you permanently criticize the economists. You really emphasize that class struggle can only exist when the party has like spread some revolutionary insight in the masses. And I think this is what I want to criticize. I think it's not true. Like in Marx, we have this dynamic of class struggle where I don't deny the role of theory and the role of party, but I think we have radically different views on what this role is. And you even said in one talk that you basically believe that class struggle creates bourgeois consciousness and not revolutionary consciousness. So that, and I mean, Luxemburg, even in her less spontaneous work in social reform or revolution, she basically agrees with Bernstein and his people and says that, okay, it's true that we need these reformist struggles. She just says their function is different than you think, because what you think is that we can just do reform, and then we will live in a very great world. And Luxemburg says, no, we do reform because this trains the proletariat, okay? It makes their class consciousness stronger. So for Luxemburg, still, class consciousness, as with Mark Fisher, is something that results from practical success or failure. The proletariat has to feel its power through class struggle. Like even if you have something just decrease the working hours or increase the wages, this gives the workers a feeling of agency and power and thereby creates class struggle. So being determines consciousness. And I think in your view, it's the other way around. It's that theory is the first step that is needed to even have class consciousness. Like you think class consciousness results from theory, and I think class consciousness first and foremost is a result of economic struggle and the success in the economic struggle. So it's being that determines consciousness. It's life that determines thinking and not the other way around.
All right. Now Ephraim has a chance to reply.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I will, I think, leave the issue of left accelerationism there, but I think, you know, it is important that Williams and Cernacek basically became Labour Party policy advisors. And I don't think it's incidental. I don't think it's accidental. I think it's kind of in the theory. And the critique that left accelerationism brings, for instance, of folk politics, or for instance, of the need for strategy, is basically very indeterminate. It tells us very little about what the politics are. And that's why it can kind of collapse back into those types of things. Okay, Marx wanted to accelerate capitalism. I would say no. Marx wanted to raise the crisis of society to the level of consciousness such that it could be overcome and worked through in practice. And so the acceleration would, if we want to use that word, happen, you know, through the dictatorship of the proletariat. And that the crucial point there is raising it to consciousness of what's happening, right? So that we're not subject to the dynamic, but that we're able to master it. Now, importantly, and I think this is where we don't agree, but you suggested that we might, is that the development of capitalism is not simply a matter of taking over the means of production, but actually a question of transforming the means of production. That the bourgeois social relations that are in crisis in capitalism, in trying to overcome those, you will actually transform the mode of production itself and not just fall into the position which I raised Moshe Postone to critique, that you maintain the same mode of production but have a different mode of distribution. And I think that that's what your position leads into, and it's based on the way that the theory of capitalism that accelerationism develops and that also Badiou develops kind of has an external relationship between technology and society. Okay, so being before consciousness, I think this is just the wrong way of thinking about it, right? This is it's kind of pre-Kantian philosophy. The reason why I raised Althusser is because it does kind of come from this new left turn, its current role on the left. I think the question that we need to ask rather is the question of social practice, right? So how is what we are doing, how can we become aware of it, our social practice, to the point at which we can change it? And therefore, how does it require critique, right? So how can we become critically aware of what we're doing such that we can change it? Because the separation of being and consciousness that you insist on keeps the relationship of the two external, and then you can't actually change what you're doing. Now, I think this gets to the important point about the trade unions and the class struggle. When Marxists argue that trade union struggles lead to bourgeois consciousness, it's because the demands of the working class for the value of their labor, for their pay and so on, are actually what reproduce capitalism, because they reproduce the bourgeois social relations, which are in fact in crisis under conditions of industrial production. And that's what I tried to get at with my whole example of the Luddites and then the trade unions. The issue for Marxism is how can precisely this process become aware of itself and overcome itself through itself. That's the dialectic, right? It's not an external thing that is going to lead us out of capitalism.
You have about 1 minute.
It has to be in and through capitalism, right? And that's what it means to overcome capitalism on the basis of itself. Now, what is this socialist consciousness? It's not kind of the better ideas that we have that we're going to come and tell the people. It's a consciousness of history, right? It's a consciousness of the tasks that arose with bourgeois society, how they've come into crisis, and how the existence of the proletariat is the primary expression of that crisis, right? So the task facing us in overcoming capitalism is, as Marx put it, not the preservation of the proletariat, but the abolition of the proletariat. I think the reason why I talked about Lenin in my talk is because I think the anti-Lukács, or the idea that idealism comes from Lukács, is actually a way of avoiding the issue of Lenin and Lenin's politics, and it turns it into a question of theory and philosophy. And really the question is one of politics. What's the political task? And I think that's what Luxemburg posed when she said, which I quoted in my opening remarks, that it's the goal of our movement which raises the struggle to a class struggle, that it becomes a class struggle within that political goal. And that's because of the political task that's necessary, namely the dictatorship of the proletariat, for beginning the process of overcoming capitalism. Otherwise, you do end up with a kind of economism or revisionism of progressively developing the means for a socialist society within capitalism.
Right, thank you. Yeah. And now Dennis will have the opportunity to reply, but I think then we will cross the 1 hour mark, and after that we'll go into questions from the audience. So as a quick reminder, you can now post your questions in the chat, and if it's addressed to anybody specifically, please make sure to state that.
Okay, so Marx was a historical materialist, and this means that he had like a certain worldview and a certain way how he thought about society. And you can see this most clearly in his like in the German ideology, and also in the Poverty of Philosophy, and obviously in the Manifesto. And in all of those works, the idea is that there's a primacy of like are different formulations of this. Like the most strict ones we can find in the Poverty of Philosophy, where there's basically a primacy of technology. So there he says that technology, like the development of the productive forces, is everything. And even the mode of production, like the rest of the mode, like the Produktionsverhältnisse, relations of production, just emerged from technology. So you have the hand mill, and then you have a certain society that corresponds with it. I think in this case it was feudalism, and then if you have the steam mill, you have capitalism. So this is basically what Marx says in The Poverty of Philosophy, that he's like a techno-determinist. So technology determines how we make the economy, and the economy determines the rest. Now, I think this changes a little bit, and he increases what counts as the basis of society, but still there is a primacy of the economy. This is the basic idea of Marx's historical materialism. Furthermore, we have some processes which are happening, which are not processes which like individual people, because of their ideas, like they consciously shape them, but it's just something that happens because of a certain dynamic. So in this sense, Marx thinks about society in as a complex of different economic and social dynamics, which develop according to certain laws, which Engels even linked to laws of nature. So for me, like the basic insight of Marxism, which is also something Land and Fisher talk about, this cybernetic thing, is not to talk about society as composed just of individuals which live in their like liberal individual free will stuff, and then they do whatever they want because they have certain ideas, but it's a machine that develops according to certain principles of historical and economic development. So Marx said about ideas that the phantoms formed in the human brain are also necessarily supplements of the material life process, which is empirically verifiable and bound to material premises. And like you can find like a billion of these quotes. Like he always says that, like, you accuse Marx of being like a bad thinker when you say that it's bad thinking to talk about the opposition of consciousness and being, of material and ideal. But this is something Marx does all the time. Like, it's one of his primary ideas, that we have this economic dynamic in capitalism, which for him is basically the rise of technology, which he thinks will destroy capitalism, because there will be like an opposition between the development of the productive forces, technological development, and the relations of production. So basically capitalism. So he thinks capitalism will be destroyed because technology will advance to a point where it's no longer compatible with capitalism. So this is one of the theses he proposes all the time. And the second one is that capitalism, because of its structural like anatomy, will necessarily create the proletariat, which has life interests opposed to the capitalist class. So class struggle for Marx in the Communist Manifesto, for example, is there all the time, which doesn't mean that there's no role for communists and we should all be determinists. It just means class struggle is there all the time because it emerges from the inherent movement of capitalism. Like, it's in the anatomy of the system to create these two classes and to pit them against each other. So this is a self-propelling process of class struggle. And okay, so this whole dynamic view about capitalism as a society which has these internal contradictions about technology and the organization of labor, and also about capitalists versus proletarians, it's really central to Marxism. The same is true about the whole historical materialism. I think that if you go too much into Lukács and this stuff, you forget what Marxism is really about. And I'm really concerned about that. So, and I think you seem to equate materialism with determinism, which is just not the case. Like, you can be a materialist and still not be a determinist.
About 30 seconds.
Yeah, it's different things. And lastly, just to make it a little bit provocative, I think what you think is, you think that how can trade unionist thought turn into socialist thought? And yeah, I agree with you. This is strange if you think about it like this, but I would propose that we think about it in another way. And this would be like this: how can a trade unionist movement turn into a socialist movement? And this is pretty, like, if you look at history, this is pretty conceivable. Like, every big revolutionary movement, like the February Revolution, the French Revolution, everything, it's always like they begin with totally timid like things they want, and they radicalize in a few years. Like, it's a really rapid process. You cannot explain it by saying that some communist party or like Jacobin party has slowly spread this consciousness. Like, this wasn't how the Bolsheviks worked. Like, they lost members all the time after 1905 revolution, and then when there was the February Revolution, like they get this massive surge. So the whole this whole idea, I think, is wrong. We have to talk a lot more about spontaneity, how class consciousness develops through class struggle, and how workers, like when they win a strike, they learn how they can have more solidarity, band together. And this is a very important process that the left has to intervene in, amplify and strengthen. Like we have to develop the processes inside of capitalism right now, which are already existing and which we can amplify. And then in the end, of course, in the end, we need some socialist communist party who has an idea about communism.
Now,
okay, yeah, but it's not the main task right now, okay?
All right, thank you very much, guys. And now we'll go to the questions. I have collected some questions from the chat and I will read them to you. First question I found was, what needs to be accelerated? What needs to be slowed down? How are they connected? And why do you think so? This is not addressed to anybody specific, so if any of you would like to answer, you can.
I would just say that what I tried to demonstrate in my opening remarks is that the idea that some things need to be accelerated and some things need to be slowed down is actually not the question, but that is the way that capitalism appears to us, right? It appears to be something that's both going too fast and going too slow, and that affects all aspects of our lives, as well as economic production, and that this kind of apparent antinomy can reveal to us something about what Marx thought about the self-contradiction of bourgeois social relations in capitalism. I think that accelerationism, which I argued is very different from Marx in terms of the understanding of what capitalism is, falls into upholding one side of this antinomy. Certainly in the kind of Nick Land version. And I think what you get with Mark Fisher is an attempt to add some politics into that. And then I think it becomes quite confused at that point. But I would say that the question we're facing today on the left is the question of regression, how we're actually repeating problems and tasks formulated better earlier on in the late 19th and in Marx's time and in the early 20th century, and that the defeats of the left throughout the 20th century are being repeated in the present in less and less conscious forms. So what we might need to arrest, right, not slow down, but arrest, is the repetition. And I think actually in capitalist realism, Mark Fisher did recognize something about this repetition of a kind of repressed feeling about the defeats of the left in the 20th century, and that actually it masks our morose conservatism, he said. So I think in order to recognize that, we need to think about what that experience has been and how actually there's a huge gulf between where we are today and where Marxism 100 years ago was. So I think, with Lukács, for example, it's not the case that Lukács explains the regression of the left, but Lukács is talking about a much different problem, which is the crisis of the Second International. Right, there is no Second International today. There we don't have that objective critique. So the problem is rather the forgetting of Lukács's insights into that in the absence of its objective critique.
Dennis, would you also like to make a statement? We could go on.
Let's go on because we have to answer a lot of questions.
Okay, we do have a lot of questions. That's correct. To Dennis, failures can be valuable, but which failures? The failures of bourgeois politics or the failures involved in the independent political organization of the working class that is still not here?
Okay, so the thing is, I mean, this is the thing. When we think about us as like leftist organizers or intellectuals, we can obviously learn from failures of the past in a totally different way than a movement learns. So we can have this like lessons learned, and then we have an analytic process and we learn some things, and then we can apply it in the future. And this is important because yeah, I don't say that we don't need communists and we just need the spontaneity of the masses, but the task of the communists, of the socialists, of the party is precisely to amplify this movement that exists independently from below. And thereby, obviously, sometimes you can give some tips to them, like say, okay, don't do that, you have to do that, but not basically from the beginning try to preach Marx to them, but just to say them what they have to do next. Like, for example, it would be, in my opinion, it would be much more valuable right now to say, okay, we have to fight for the 30-hour working week or something like this, yeah? Something Mark Fisher also says, maybe our trade unionist struggle should be less about wages and more about something else. And I say, yes, let's go back to time. Like time, the 8-hour day fight, this was really important in the time when orthodox Marxism was strong. Like the whole workers' movement formed around the reduction of the working hour. So this would be something we could give them, like, because we know, oh, maybe this is a good thing to say right now, so we can try to inject it. But the most important thing is obviously just to support these movements. Now, failures can give us some experience to just, yeah, to be more effective in supporting working class struggles. For the masses, they have a totally different function. Like they can be really demoralizing, destroying the whole like organizational process. But if they are just like halfway failures where people still feel their power and they see, oh fuck, the bourgeoisie took it away from us in the last moment, then they can be like radicalizing, so that people see, oh, we were so close and then they took it from us, so let's be more angry. So I think, yeah, we have to really differentiate whether we mean, what about us as like some kind of leftist groups or activists who think about these things. Okay, for us, failure is just something to analyze, but for the mass movement, it can be something really traumatic and demoralizing, but it can also be in other historical circumstances when they still feel their power. It can be something which makes them more militant, and therefore even like sometimes I think it's even part of the necessary learning process that this movement needs to fail at a certain point, and then see that maybe more radical action is necessary. But it's necessary that the movement goes through these stages and actually experiences those things. Exactly. So this would be my answer.
Can I just add something briefly, which is that,
Sure.
Of course, the struggle over time was the struggle over wages, and the struggle over wages was the struggle over time. I mean, the two are related. And I realize that it seems like what we need today is to first restart the class struggle, and then we can, talk about whether it's going to be socialist or not. But I think you're kind of avoiding the issue of the ideological obstacles, not necessarily in the working class itself, but on the left. Like, why is it that we or the left can't agree on what its purpose is, right? That there are different positions on the left that disagree, and that these have been an obstacle to giving advice to any working class struggles at all. So the idea that, well, we'll just go down there and tell them, like, keep going, you're doing a great job, and then they'll grow stronger, avoids the ideological obstacles that exist, that are inherited from the history of defeat.
Thank you. So
one
question
sentence.
One sentence, but then we got to go on.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's more important that the workers' movement grows. So we cannot unify the left first and make everyone a Marxist. It has to be a process, and this process goes through intensification of class struggle. Like this is the prerequisite for everything else, that we can even start to have like a bigger, more organized left and stuff like this. So class struggle is the most basic thing we need to get this whole machine going.
Okay. So question to Ephraim. Fisher thought that consciousness can also come from aesthetic experience. What does Platypus say to this? Adorno could relate. Just romanticism?
Consciousness of what? Right? I mean, there's consciousness and then there's consciousness. I think the issue that Dennis and I were debating is the issue of socialist consciousness or class consciousness. Certainly, I think for Adorno, what the question that Art raised was a consciousness of freedom or the lack of freedom. And so, both in form and content and in the relation between the two, it expressed a crisis of the problem of freedom in society. I think Fisher doesn't really raise the issue of freedom or where that question might come from. And that's, tied to his narrative about the history of capitalism. When I was, and I also think that like the question of art is slightly different, although related to the question of the kind of popular culture that Mark Fisher was addressing, and obviously that's a kind of fraught issue, the relationship between the two. When I was calling accelerationism romanticism, I was referring more to this response to a crisis of the feeling of time in capitalism. And I think we do experience time in a more or less romantic way, or a kind of crisis of time in capitalism. And I think that's what accelerationism is responding to. And a lot of Fisher's discussion, for example, of like retromania, Simon Reynolds, but hauntology and all that kind of stuff, is about time and a kind of feeling about time, and the way that he and Nick Land took up speed and jungle music and that kind of cultural expression was really about that feeling of time in capitalism. And I think that per se is romantic.
All right, thank you. A question to Dennis. Your recipe seems to be win in order to start winning. But if we need to start winning to win, how do we, start winning?
Yeah, this is a very good question. So basically, because my analysis is, okay, we have this kind of positive feedback loop. Okay, if you have victories beget other victories, because the class consciousness will be raised if people see, oh my God, we can do it, like we did this strike. And many people have this idea about strikes and reforms and movements, that it's like a negative feedback loop. Like, I'm discontent, I'm angry, I want something, like fuck you, I want more wages or less working hours, stuff like this. And then I fight for it and I get it. And then I'm like, oh, nice, I got it. Okay, now I'm content again. So this would be like a self-stabilizing negative feedback loop, where if people get too angry, they do political action and then they win, and then they are content. Oh my God, everything's fine. And then they are like basically, again, like normal people, and they don't do politics anymore. And on the other hand, if things get too shitty, people get angry, and then they again do something, and then they make it normal again. So it basically, this whole mechanism stabilizes the status quo. And I think the truth is exactly the other way around. And the way Luxemburg describes it in her mass strike, it's totally the other way around. And also, like, I did some with a friend, like an Iranian friend of mine, we looked at some empirical data about strikes, and it also shows it's definitely like the other way around. It's a positive feedback loop. Defeats lead to a lower organization degree of the working class, whereas victories increase the organization degree. So it's not the case that if you win on a societal level, then the whole working class will be like asleep again. But if some people win, this will give the impression like it will weaken capitalist realism. It will give people beliefs in themselves, like we can change something. Like you don't have to be, they don't have to be Marxists from the beginning. They just need this feeling we can band together as workers and we can change something. And this will like spread and make other people do the same thing. But if they lose, this is a material effect on their consciousness, which makes them just retreat into private life, or just like, you know, they will give up. So yeah, now we have this positive feedback loop and we just want to have the spiral of victories. And now the question is, how do we get there? Like, how do we get there? And if we are determinists, we can say, no, we can't get there because it's just an objective process. But look, there are few people who can be influenced by theory. It's like people like us, like the vast majority of society. You can't just tell them a few theories and then they will make a revolution. They need this process of material change, and it has to be a long process. Like people have been talking about communism all the time before the October Revolution. No one cared about this. And then when there was the right situation, like mass mobilization by the workers, people suddenly did care. Or French Revolution, like you had Republican ideas all the time, but in the beginning of the revolution, there was almost no Republicans. And then when it all radicalized as a real movement, the radicalization of thought followed. So I think there is a time and place when we can like make more of a mass spreading of socialist ideas, because we will need it when we do this political transition, like when we really do socialism. But we are not at this point right now. We are at the point where we need to build the mass movement, which will enable this whole thing. So they need this dynamic to go from victory to mobilize, and then they have like fights against the state and stuff like this. It has to be this growing social dynamic, which we have to enable. How do we do this? Mainly by directly intervening into class struggle, not intervening to make propaganda, but really to make them win. So this is what ADH wants to do. Like if we grow more, like we want to have our membership base, but not just use them as an educational tool, but to train them in organizing, in like how to like do media work and stuff, and then concentrically intervene into different struggles in society. So if we see like the healthcare workers are making a big strike and it's in the media and it's an important sector, then we intervene, we support them. We try to do something on the material basis of society to change the way class struggle goes. And also, you can also intervene with theory, but you have to do it like, you have to think about what is the current situation. So not just say all the time, yeah, we just need to have communism and this is how capitalism works and so on. So no, you need the right impulses at the right time. So for example, if you think the time is ready, just say, okay, maybe we should fight for the 30-hour week. So always our task as communists is to accompany, to convoy like the real mass movement, and to anticipate what will its next steps be, where can we support it most effectively. But we are bound to this movement, this proletarian movement, this mobilization from below. And this is our task. If we consider ourselves to be some kind of conscious elements who know what's going on, then okay, then we have to consciously support the movement, the real movement, not do our own thing, but the movement is there, out there, people who fight for like better wages, less working hours, stuff like this. And this is whom we have to support, and to just use our energies to make them win, and thereby try to create this positive feedback loop.
Thank you.
Can I just add something to that, which is
you can.
You know, that has been tried many times by many different left-wing groups in the 20th century. At different moments, they, in however small numbers, have thought that they need to go to the workers, go to the point of production, for example, in the 1930s, but also in the 1970s. And I think one needs to consider why that didn't work, right? And so there are questions raised by, you know, what you'd actually be training people to do there, and what you would tell people, and then what you would do with them afterwards. And I think the way in which the kind of turn to the masses and the turn to the point of production has functioned in the history of the left, particularly at moments of kind of the aftermath of defeats, needs to be considered. So in the failure of the New Left, there was a turn to industrialization or proletarianizing people. And they had very high-level complex ideas about how they were doing it. And there was much higher trade union density at that time. So the situation was much more auspicious for what they were trying to do. However, they still failed. And I think we need to consider how that is still affecting us today. I think sometimes you present these ideas as if they've just come up for the first time. These are very old ideas. And unless we're conscious of the history of how that's played out, then we might end up repeating the failures without realizing it.
Thank you. A question to Ephraim. You talked about accelerationism of Fisher, but what about hauntology, melancholy in the work of Fisher? Mourning, reflection, lost possible futures in the past.
That's it.
That's the question.
Okay. The idea that the future has been lost, or that it's become impossible to imagine the future, is not a original idea to Mark Fisher. It's an idea that was, for example, already in one of his favorite authors, J.G. Ballard. There's a famous introduction to a reprint of Crash where J.G. Ballard says something like, the all-voracious present has eaten the future. But we can also go back even further. In Reflections on Class Theory from 1942, Adorno says something like, I can't remember what the exact line is, but the imagining that things might be different requires an almost hopeless amount of hope. So I think we need to, again, I think the problem with, Fisher's concept of melancholy, and I think that the quote Dennis read out about his experience crying in 1985 at the return of miners to work is really marked by his own experience of neoliberalism. And I think that skews the perspective on the entire 20th century, and up to over 100 years now, of a kind of loss of the future and defeat. And so I think it becomes kind of limited in that sense. When in my article, Forgetting Mark Fisher, I had a little epigraph, which was a quote from Mark Fisher, which was, in my entire lifetime, every time you think the left is getting somewhere, the right is one step ahead of it. And I included the dates of his life, 1968 to 2017. And I think that those dates are kind of indicative of, basically marking the beginning and the end of the neoliberal period. And I think that the question of kind of mourning and hauntology, which again kind of comes from postmodernism, is very much kind of fixated on neoliberalism. And that's precisely why, when the crisis of neoliberalism came, Fisher was kind of unable to respond. That what Dennis quoted from Fisher describing as the tear in the curtain that can come at any moment actually came from the right. And what ended up happening was that the left basically ended up defending the neoliberal order it had been grown accustomed to opposing. And I think accelerationism and Fisher's work are part of that. Having said that, I'm obviously aware of the kind of the resonance with Marx's phrase from the 18th Brumaire that the the dead generations weigh on like a nightmare on the brain of the living. So we should actually also think about how Fisher is tapping into something about the dynamic of history in capitalism, that history itself is in crisis. And that's why I think Marxism was not so concerned with imagining what the future might be like, but rather working through this crisis in history. And that was its task of critique.
Thank you. So a question to Dennis. What precisely would be the connection between materialist strategy and the hegemonic approach that Cernak-Williams, I don't know how to pronounce the name, propagate in the Accelerationist manifesto?
Okay, so I love this question. It's a very good one because, like we in ADH, we have read this manifesto and we found it to be very nice and we love it. And basically, the thing is that Cernak and Williams, like their general left accelerationist ideas that we should reject folk politics in favor of this kind of strategic view that the left has to win and actually like empirically think about how to do this and stuff like this. This is something I totally support, but I think in a certain sense they are a little bit too much Gramscian. Like I don't totally disagree with this approach. I just think that it's rather one-sidedly focused on the idea that like we have to use just media and theory work and stuff like this to influence society. So basically they also propose to found some kind of a platform like a communist party and this, or like a network of different organizations, and this kind of revolutionary like organized subject then has to use media expertise and theory work and stuff like this to spread their ideas. And basically this is what ADH is also doing right now. But we think that this can only be our first phase to gain more members, and then it will be about amplifying these struggles which are going on everywhere in society. So basically this politics of intervening into class struggle. And yeah, one thing about to Ephraim, yeah, of course, this is not something new. But like the thing you are proposing is also not something new, right? We are having a debate we could have been having like in the time of orthodox Marxism. Like there have been the debates on economism, like there have been debates on for example, the even with Kautsky, you have this idea that consciousness can only come from the outside. So it's not Lenin who first invented it, it's already Kautsky, and it's already in Luxemburg. But Luxemburg, like she struggles with this in social reform or revolution, I would say. And then in mass strike, she has a more like position which is much closer to my position. But I know that you at Platypus read it differently, but I think like it has predominantly been read as a advocacy for the spontaneity idea, and you certainly have the snowballing effect ideas in this work. So basically I know why you prefer social reform or revolution and why I prefer the mass strike, because I think Luxemburg has changed a little bit in there. But I think I would really love to just discuss this one work, social reform or revolution, with you or something like this, because I think there's a lot to be learned from this.
That would be a great discussion.
Yeah, but I think this is like, so the whole thing we are discussing right now, it's all in a certain sense old stuff. Of course, we have new perspectives now. We have Mark Fisher, we have this idea of the regression of the left, but this basic debate on materialism and economism and stuff like that, this is an old debate. So every strategy has been tried by the left, and every strategy has failed in the sense that we don't have socialism right now. So the question is just to say what could have worked if we were a lot more lucky or more skilled, or we had the better objective conditions. So saying that something has failed in the past, I think it's not an argument. So the problem with this Gramscian, so I think this Gramsci thing, which is an inherent part of Cernak and Williams, it is valuable, but it has to be subordinated to this idea of amplifying the working class movement. So when we, for example, have this intervention into media or something, we should try to make it something that amplifies class struggle. So for example, let's say we have this really great left-wing media outlets. We should use them to draw attention to what is happening on the sphere of the class struggle, and for example, give the right like paroles at the right time. So when there's coronavirus, we should talk about coronavirus. When we have like a strike, we should talk about the strike. When we think now it's the time to talk about 30 hours, we should do that. So basically, we should subordinate this like hegemonic approach, this Gramsci approach, to the intervention in class struggle. And one thing for you to read, like Gramsci has written something about Luxembourg where he criticizes her. I don't agree with him, but it's an interesting debate. So to get into this stuff, to see that there are like different approaches to strategy and what we think is more important, like the class struggle or the hegemony on the sphere of ideas and culture and stuff. It's very fascinating stuff.
Can I just comment on that quickly? I agree with you, obviously, that my ideas are not new at all, and I am actually, my whole aim is to raise old historical ideas, namely Marxism. And however, I don't think we would have had this debate 100 years ago. I don't think you're really an economist. You're not like the rabbit-eyed yellow economism that Lenin was critiquing. We need to recognize what is missing, which is the context of the mass Second International and the socialist parties. And that changes the nature of these debates fundamentally. It's not simply a matter of, that didn't work in the past, so don't try it again, nor is it simply a matter of we need to find in better conditions, which ones would have worked, and so let's just try a bit harder. The question we're facing is, how are those defeats acting on us in the present? How is, to talk about haunting, how are those defeats haunting us and perhaps limiting our imagination of what's necessary and what's possible, and importantly, obscuring our reading of history? And I think the Luxembourg case is instructive, because it's not simply a matter of different readings of the mass strike pamphlet. It's actually an outcome of the defeat of the left after the Russian Revolution, and the fact of the Russian Revolution itself that led to people wanting to oppose Luxembourg to Lenin. And so they read the mass strike in a particular way in order to recover the concept of spontaneity out of a kind of anti-Stalinism, or before that, anti-Leninism. And so even these different readings, as you put it, are really are again very old, and they are affected by the political situation and the way that these defeats are acting on us. I think the attempt to separate Luxembourg's spontaneity in the mass strike from her Marxism in Reformer Revolution, and to separate her from Lenin, is wrong. She actually wrote the mass strike pamphlet whilst basically on summer holiday with Lenin in 1906, and they were reading each other's drafts all the time. I think the argument about the mass strike is in relation to the party and the trade unions, the full title. And I think that the way that those have become opposed to each other, that Lenin is the vanguard party and the leader, and that Luxembourg is the spontaneous, is a result of the death of the left in the 20th century, and they are kind of responses to trying to understand that failure that actually obscure the meaning of the original Marxism.
One thing very shortly, I don't believe in this kind of Lenin versus Luxembourg opposition in this crude sense. But I really think that there is a very gradual opposition between this view that is more centered on the role of theory as the necessary precondition for class struggle, and another idea which views class struggle more as a self-accelerating process. And I think that this is a debate which is constantly going on, and you cannot just put some labels on people and say, okay, this person is totally like this one and the other one is just totally spontaneous. But there is this question, and this is I think a very important question where we are not of the same opinion. And yeah, so that's that. And basically, I think with the October Revolution, I'm totally a Leninist in this sense. I totally support what they did, but it was not spreading like this communist idea to the masses. Like it wasn't like this. So this whole Kautskian thing that the party has the class consciousness and gives it to the proletariat, it's totally not what happened in the October Revolution. Like it was, in a certain sense, it really was this kind of blanquism almost, which I don't judge it. Like I don't think it's wrong or something. I would have done exactly the same. I love Lenin for doing this, but you shouldn't make the mistake to like say that Lenin's practice is just like a continuation of his theory. We should read the October Revolution in a really historical sense. So look at what really happened and not how leftists wrote about it. So I think we need, I agree with you Platypus guys that we need to have more consciousness of history. But for me, history is real history, like history in what happened and not how leftists thought about it. And I think by studying history, we can really go forward to developing our theory and look, okay, what did Lenin actually do and not what did he say that he does it.
I would just raise there that precisely Walter Benjamin's critique of historicism, namely history as what was, which ignores what it could have been and perhaps should have been, was tied to the progressive theory of history that informed the revisionism of Bernstein and that led to the capitulation of the SPD to war credits and the murder of Rosa Luxemburg. So actually, the problem isn't history as what was, which would be a kind of historicism, but rather how a kind of critical history. How should and could it be? What's the unfulfilled potential of history? And how does history critique us now in the present?
Okay, I'd like to read just a few more questions. We're already over time, but I will have some of which I think we should talk about. To Dennis, if we understand historical materialism as a scientific, sociological, historical theory, is it empirically adequate? And please try to keep your answer as brief as possible.
Okay, so this is exactly what I'm talking about. Like, look at history, how it happened, and what we can infer from it. So, for example, if you look at, I already mentioned the French Revolution. I had this course in when I studied history where we looked at some, like there was some kind of people were asked, what do you want to change in France? And it was anonymous, so people didn't have to be afraid about like saying some weird bullshit. It was a really good primary source, and everything people said was like totally pro-royalist. Like it was just like, the king has to be a little bit nicer to us, or less corruption and stuff like that. And then we have this giant revolution, like just a few months later, and then like it takes a few years for it to accelerate to a point where then you have like republicanism, and then you have this third like revolution where the Jacobins, like the radical Jacobins, come to power. And so if you want to explain why people do certain things here, you just can't do it by saying it's because some philosophers spread some ideas. It's because of a dynamic that happens through this historical process. And the same is true with regard to the Russian Revolution. If you look at the membership of the Bolsheviks, like before 1905, it's like maybe like 15,000 or something. And then I think the biggest point was in 1907, when after the 1905-1906 revolution, they had like a massive influx of people. They had 150,000, so 10 times more people. After this revolution, it went back to 1500, where also many historians say most of them were not even real members. And then again, in the February revolution and then October revolution, the number went up to, I think in February 1917, like our February, they had just 24,000 members. And then by September, it was 200,000 members. So it has nothing to do with like this kind of spreading of theory, like the people educating each other and this slow, gradual like education, this idealist conception that we spread some idea and then we talk to people and we convince them about the Marxist arguments. It's totally clear that these numbers reflect what is happening in society. that society determines the class struggle, the economic situation. This determines what ideas will be successful and which won't. And like, it's everywhere. If you look at any kind of revolution or movement, when people change their minds, it's always because something changes on the level of society. It's never because just some philosophers and academics are really good at doing educational work. So I think the empirical support, if you just look at historical revolutions, historical developments, the empirical support for a materialist understanding of consciousness is extremely strong. Like, you can't explain it in any other way consistently.
I would just add it's not a question of a few academics with their ideas. It's a question of politics. And that's what you're leaving out with the sudden turnaround of the masses. You're leaving out how politics is already implicated in this process. And there's a political question there. The second point I'll make, and this is kind of very important for Marxism, is that there's a major difference between the French Revolution and a bourgeois revolution and the proletarian revolution. And this is the whole reason why Marx addresses, actually, I think the first time he uses the term regression, which is with respect to the trajectory of the 1848 revolution, which doesn't go like the French Revolution of the 1790s did, to increasingly more radical stages in a kind of unconscious way, but actually regresses. And Marx's whole point, which is the lessons of 1848, is that unlike the bourgeois revolutions, which could be more or less unconscious of the process that was happening, the proletarian revolution requires consciousness, otherwise it will basically reproduce a bourgeois revolution that will fail, that will undermine itself, and that will regress. That the necessary tasks posed by the proletarian revolution of the 19th century, because Marx's whole thing is, how is the revolution of the 19th century different from that of the 18th century, actually requires a different relationship to history and to consciousness. So it's very important that you brought up the French Revolution, because actually there's a difference there, which is the existence of industrial capitalism and the proletariat, and the tasks that that poses, at least in Marx's view.
Okay, thank you. So I feel there's a lot of stuff we could still talk about. I feel there are a lot of potential discussion for the future that became clear today. I'd like to thank both Ephraim and Dennis, and I would pose one final question, which both can answer, and maybe this will be a nice wrap up. All the while, I'll post links for ADH content in the chat, and if the Platypus people present would like to link to their conference, I think that would be great too. So my final question for today would be, how does one begin to address the present in a material sense? So whoever would like to start, you can start.
Do you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. How does one address the present in a material sense? I would say that we need to consider how the tasks that face us in the present, and which are expressed in the material conditions and crises of politics and our lives, are informed by history, right? They're informed by the way that problems have been expressed and attempted to be grappled with in the past. And that those actually have a material impact, both on what's happening in society and our kind of consciousness or our own thinking about what that is. One kind of phrase from Marx that actually expresses this, not only in a kind of metaphorical way, is that dead labour dominates living labour. And the other phrase that I mentioned earlier of the dead generations weighing on the present like a nightmare on the brain of the living. So I think we need to think about how the past is actually acting materially, if you must so put it, in the present. It's actually a real part of the dynamic of capitalism, as Dennis would put it. And that we need to become aware of that, because we're becoming, it seems, increasingly less aware of the way that people have tried to deal with these questions in the past. And to that extent, we are doomed to repeat them. The hope for overcoming that issue and for becoming conscious rather than being haunted by the past, which is a form of a lack of consciousness and therefore being able to act, as Rosa Luxemburg put it, for the working class to cease being a will-less football that's kicked around and to take its history into its own hands, will require working through the meaning of the past.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think we need to do that, but I think that this is not enough. I think what we also need is to have, first on the level of the left, some kind of move to organize more, so that we organize in some bigger structures which are able to actually do something. Because what I would propose next, like the intervention in class struggle, which just means to get a lot of people who are right now weighed down by capitalist realism, who don't think they can fight back, who don't think they can organize and try to fight for better working conditions, shorter working hours, or some other kind of struggle, that we need to get these people to start moving. Because I mean, in the end, I totally agree with you. We need this kind of, we need to have some idea about where that we want to abolish capitalism and not only like do trade unionism. But I think in order to even be able to think about this, we need the mobilization of the working class, and the left needs to be able to do its part to establish this, to allow this, and therefore we need to organize ourselves. Like we need to organize ourselves not only in educational and like theory and media sense, but also in the sense that we can be like that we can act. And I think that this is also something that is a task of our time. And I think that it requires us sometimes also to have people who disagree with each other to cooperate in some practical sense. So I'm really glad also that we had this discussion, because I think this is something which leads to this result. Like we need to have more exchange about these strategic questions in order to be able to form a left that is that, as I would say, is not like a victim of capitalist realism, or as you would say, it's not a result of this regression, but a left that that can take this torch of revolutionary Marxism and try to actually achieve some change in our societal relations and not just like do nothing.
I thank you very much, Dennis. I think the conversation is important, and perhaps we can have further conversations on Lukács or the Marxism of Rosa Luxemburg. We should be honest, however, that the result of that actually might not be any clear plan of action.
Yeah, of course. But I would still like to discuss those things. So, yeah.
Okay, so thank you everybody for coming. It was great, and thank you very much to Ephraim for participating, and also to Dennis. And that concludes our Fisher weekend, and I hope to see many of you in the future. See you then.
See you all.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Cheers, guys. Thank you so much.
Oh, and the video will be available on the channel.